The sky above the capital burned red with the glow of distant fires, and the cries of the people rose in endless waves of sorrow and rage. The empire that had ruled unbroken for centuries now shook under the weight of betrayal, and hope alike for the queen had chosen a path no ruler before her dared to tread. She rose not to defend the golden throne, but shatter the chains that throne had placed upon every soul that bowed before it. From a marble balcony she looked down upon the city, her hair tangled from nights. Without sleep, her eyes fierce, like steel forged in ancient flame. She was not draped in silks, but in armor scorched by battle. She had cast aside the crown that lay shattered on the stone floor of her chamber, for she no longer wished to reign. As sovereign, she wished to fight as equal. Whispers spread through every alley. The queen has betrayed the lords. The queen fights for the common folk. The queen is gathering an army. The whispers became roars, and the roars became thunder marching feet. Filled the streets, peasants, artisans, exiles, deserters, all rallied to the banner, not a kingdom, but a rebellion. The banner bore no sigil of ancient houses, only a star-painted crimson symbol of a new dawn. The Council of Lords declared her a traitor. They summoned mercenaries from distant lands clad in black iron. They promised gold rivers for the head of the queen, yet the mercenaries hesitated, for stories spread of her power, not only of blade, but of spirit, for she spoke to the people not as ruler, but as one of them, and when she spoke, men and women, who had nothing left, found courage in her words. The first clash came at the gates of the western district. The mercenaries struck in waves, their blades gleaming, but the queen herself led the charge, her voice echoing over the clash of steel. Stand with me, not for crown, not for throne, but for tomorrow. The rebels roared, and pushed back wave after wave. The streets ran with fire and ash, but the spirit of rebellion burned brighter still. Rumors whispered she carried in her veins the blood of the first guardians, an ancient line, said to wield power when the world was in peril. And though she denied such myths, her presence was undeniable. When her sword rose, the people rose. When she fell to her knees, they formed a shield around her. When she bled, they swore vengeance louder than thunder. Night after night she wrote letters by candlelight to distant villages, calling them to rise. She signed not with her royal name, but only with the mark of the Crimson Star. Farmers who had never lifted weapons carved spears from plow with women, who had never left their hard-strapped armor to their chests, children too young, for war, carried messages through forests and hills. of rebellion was no longer hers alone. It was alive. It was everyone. The king who once shared her throne watched in fury from his fortress. He had expected her to kneel to tradition, yet she broke every chain he had forged for her. She had been promised as bride to strengthen his rule, yet she had torn free now his armies, gathered not to defend the land, but to crush his queen. Still she stood, still she defied him, and her people would not let her fall. The wings of carrion birds, he believed himself untouchable, yet he underestimated the fire of his queen, for though he commanded knights sworn by oath and mercenaries bound by coin, she commanded hearts, and that was a force no blade could sever. In the dead of night the rebels moved through hidden tunnels carved long ago by slaves whose names have been erased from history. These tunnels became rivers of vengeance. The people who once dug them in chains now filled them with shouts of freedom. Torches burned like constellations beneath the earth as they marched toward the fortress walls. The queen rode at their front, her armor scratched, her hands blistered, yet her eyes unbroken. Beside her walked a boy no older than 16, carrying a banner taller than himself. He had lost his family to the king's soldiers, and when the queen found him among the ruins, he swore to carry her crimson star until the end. His voice cracked, yet it rose louder than drums when he shouted freedom. At dawn the horns of kings sounded across the valley. Legions in polished steel advanced, their shields locked their steps in perfect rhythm, like a machine built for slaughter. Yet machines do not breathe, and machines do not dream, and the rebellion breathed. With every cry and dream, with every step the clash, shook the earth. The screams of steel against steel roared louder than thunder. The queen fought at the front line, her blade striking with fury, not for conquest, but for survival. Around her fell rebels and soldiers alike, yet each time she staggered, hands reached to lift her. Each time she bled, voices shouted her name. She was no longer just queen, she was symbol living fire against the shadow of tyranny. As battle raged, a storm gathered, clouds black and thick as smoke. Winds tore through the valley. Some claimed the storm itself was called by her, while others whispered it was the guardians of old answering her bloodline. Whatever the truth, lightning split the sky, and rain poured upon the battlefield, washing blood into rivers, but neither side broke. When the storm entered, the field was littered with the fallen, yet the fortress still stood. The king from his high tower sneered down upon the broken ranks of rebels. He sent word through his messengers that the queen must surrender or the city would burn. But she answered not with surrender. She answered by marching to the gates of the eastern quarter where the poorest of the poor lived. She told them the truth that the king would set fire to their homes if she laid down her sword, and in their eyes she saw no fear. She saw defiance. They offered her not just soldiers, but everything they had bred for the hungry, water for the wounded, hope for the lost. Day by day the rebellion grew stronger, not because of weapons, but because the people themselves became the flame blacksmiths, forged swords from chained seamstresses, sewed armor from scraps. Old men taught the young how to stand and hold a spear together. They became an army born not from power, but from pain. And through it all the queen never called herself ruler. She never wore a crown again. She spoke only of tomorrow, where no lord owned the lives of others, where no throne towered above the people, where no child wept for the greed of kings. She was no longer queen by blood. She was queen by choice, by sacrifice, by rebellion. The king raged within his halls, his crown heavy upon his brow, his heart twisted with venom, for he could not comprehend why his armies faltered before peasants and farmers, why mercenaries he paid with rivers of gold abandoned their posts. He could not see that gold bought fear, but the queen gave courage, and courage could not be sold. He summoned his council of lords, men draped in velvet, their hands jeweled with stolen wealth. They urged him to crush the rebellion with fire, to starve the city with blockade, to poison the wells. And he listened, for his throne mattered more to him than the lives beneath it. Yet he did not see that even among his council seeds of doubt had begun to grow for queen words, had reached even their households, and their children whispered of freedom. Far from the fortress, the queen gathered her people upon the hills overlooking the valleys. She spoke not from scroll or speech, but from the wounds upon her hands. She told them the truth that their enemy was vast and their chances slim, but she also told them that chains weighed heavier than swords, and that even death in freedom was brighter than life in servitude. The people roared. They lifted their torches until the night sky became a second dawn, and in that light their faces were no longer weary. They were warriors born not by training, but by belief. They sang songs of rebellion, songs the king had forbidden long ago, songs that echoed across mountains and rivers until the very stones seemed to tremble with their voices. In secret the queen met with spies who slipped through shadows like ghosts. They carried maps of the fortress. They spoke of hidden passages of armories filled with weapons, and of prisoners rotting in the dungeons who still clung to hope. She vowed to free them all, for every prisoner was another heart to rise against the throne. One night, beneath the cover of mist, she led a band through the tunnels. With her walked the boy who bore the crimson star, and with them came the fiercest of rebels, women who had lost husbands, men who had lost children. They carried no banners, only silence. As they crept into the belly of the fortress, their breath shallow, their eyes sharp. The dungeon stank of rot and despair, yet when the prisoners saw her, their chains seemed lighter. They whispered her name as if it were salvation. With swift strikes they shattered locks, doors burst open, and men and women, once broken, now armed themselves with the weapons of their captors. They rose like shadows within the fortress halls. The alarm bells rang, the fortress thundered with chaos. The king roared for his guards to crush the intruders, but by then the rebellion was already within his walls. Corridors filled with fire, cries of freedom echoed through chambers that had known only tyranny. The queen stood in the grand hall, her blade glistening, her people behind her. The boy still held high the crimson star, though his arm trembled with exhaustion. She faced the golden throne across the hall, where the king sat, his face twisted with fury. He called her traitor, heretic, destroyer of order. She answered with silence, then raised her sword. The final battle had begun. The fortress burned like a wounded beast. The sky above was black with smoke, and the cries of battle echoed through every broken corridor. The queen stood with her rebels pressing deeper into the hall, where the golden throne waited. The king descended from the steps, his armor black and heavy, his sword glimmering with the blood of countless battles, his eyes filled with fury. He called her a traitor, a destroyer of order, but she raised her blade and stepped forward, her people behind her, their voices steady like a rising storm. The clash began, steel against steel, sparks flying like stars across the night. The king struck with the rage of man desperate to cling to power. The queen struck with the will of a people desperate to be free. Every blow shook the chamber, every step drove the fire higher. The boy with the crimson star held the banner, even as stones crashed around him, blood upon his face. Yet his voice carried through the smoke, freedom, freedom, he cried. And the word carried through the fortress, across the city, across the valley, until it became a chant upon the wind. Even the lords who once feasted beside the king trembled, some fleeing, others casting down their blades, some kneeling before the queen as the tide turned. The battle raged on until the throne itself cracked beneath the weight of flame. The crown rolled across the stone floor and lay broken. The king faltered, his strength waning, his breath heavy. He spat curses, that the land would fall without his rule, that the queen had doomed them all. She answered with steady resolve, saying the land had already fallen under his chains, and that freedom, no matter the cost, was brighter than endless rule. With a final strike, she drove her blade into him, and the chamber fell silent, his body crumbling his shadow. Fading, the rebels roared, but she lifted her hand, and silence returned. She told them victory was not the end, it was a beginning. Rebellion was not about trading one crown for another. It was about ending crowns forever. She swore before them all that she would never wear the crown, never sit upon the throne. Her place was among them, not above them. They raised a crimson star upon the highest tower, tearing down the banners of gold. The city erupted with voices of hope. The flames of war still burned, yet they no longer felt like destruction. They felt like dawn. The queen stood upon the tower, scarred, weary, but unbroken. Beside her stood the boy with the banner. The freed prisoners, the farmers, the artisans, the mothers, and the children together. They looked to the horizon, not to a throne, not to a crown, but to a future they would build with their own hands. The rebellion had ended, yet the struggle would go on, for tomorrow belonged to them all. The days after the fall of the king were filled with silence, and rebuilding the fortress that had once stood as a symbol of fear now stood as a ruin, scorched by fire, its broken stones scattered across the valley. The people gathered there not to kneel, but to work together. They cleared the ashes and raised shelters for the wounded. They shared food and water. Without fear of punishment, they looked to the queen for orders, yet she gave none. She spoke only of choices. And each day she reminded them that this new world would be theirs, not hers alone. Villages that had long hidden in shadows began to send their people into the open. Some walked with hesitation, others with joy. They carried gifts not of gold or tribute, but of grain, of cloth, of tools. They wished not to serve, but to join. The queen welcomed them not as subjects, but as brothers and sisters. She embraced the old, the young, the strong, and the broken. She listened to their stories and told them they were the foundation of the future. In the nights, fires burned in circles across the hills where the rebels gathered not to plan war, but to sing songs that had once been forbidden. Their voices rose into the dark sky, carrying tales of the fallen, of the brave, of the children who would now grow free. Elders spoke of the day when chains had been broken, and the youth listened with wide eyes, vowing never to let tyranny return. But shadows linger for freedom. One is never freedom. Secured rumors spread of distant lords who had not knelt, of mercenaries who still hunted for coin, of old allies who whispered of seizing power. In the chaos, the queen knew that the rebellion was not a single victory, but a lifetime of struggle. She told her people to remain vigilant, that tyranny would return not always in armor and swords, but in whispers and promises and greed. One evening she stood again upon the tower, where once the crimson star had been raised. The banner still flew high, its fabric torn yet proud. She looked out upon the valley, where fields were already being tilled, where children ran laughing, where smoke rose from new forges building tools instead of weapons. Her eyes softened, yet she did not rest. She knew the road ahead was endless. The boy with the crimson star, now a young man, stood beside her, scarred from battles, his voice steadier than before. He asked her what tomorrow would bring, and she told him tomorrow would bring trials, but also hope. Tomorrow would bring enemies, but also allies. Tomorrow would bring sorrow, but also joy. She told him the star he carried was no longer hers alone. It belonged to them all, and he swore to keep it high for as long as he lived. Years would pass, and songs would spread across the land, songs of a queen who cast aside her crown, songs of a people who rose from chain, songs of rebellion that turned into a new beginning. The golden throne would become nothing more than shattered stone, yet the crimson star would shine across generations, not as symbol of power, but as promise of freedom. And when travelers came from distant lands, they did not speak of kings or lords. They spoke of the rebellion. They spoke of the queen who refused to rule. They spoke of a people who chose to stand as one, and in their words the world changed. The queen lived not as monarch, but as guardian, not of thrones, but a hope. Her story was written not in crowns or jewels, but in the hearts of her people, who whispered it to their children and their children after them.